following is a work of fiction and should not be taken as actual history.
Meet Professor Roger Hill, historian, adventurer, and raconteur extraordinaire. He travels to parallel worlds where history went differently and brings back lectures on his findings. So grab a prime seat, pay attention, and take good notes. This is Alternate History 100. Welcome to the class.
Good morning. I've spoken before about my high school history teacher, Mr. Celsius, and his belief that history is a series of waves and inevitabilities. I've told you of his dismissal of the great man theory, and yes, much of my traveling seems to prove that he was right. I can't find a world where the United States existed and the Civil War didn't happen. Even in the one where Abraham Lincoln died in childhood from a horse kick to the head, war still came and the slaves were still freed. Sooner or later. World War I also seems to come up in every timeline, regardless of whether Gavrilo Princip assassinates Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. It appears that the Rube Goldberg string of alliances that existed in the early 20th century create an unstoppable chain of events once something, anything, sets them in motion. Sooner or later. In those words, I thought of a different way to test the great man theory of history. How much difference would later make? Pop quiz. Who invented the steam engine? Anybody?
James Watt.
James Watt. Good answer. Commonly believed, but not correct. But a good answer nonetheless, because Mr. Watt is the point of divergence between our world and the one that I visited. In our world and that one, an Englishman named Thomas Savery invented a steam-powered water pump in 1698. And in 1712, another Englishman, Thomas Newcomen, created a better, more powerful steam-powered pump. Better, but still not terribly efficient. But his machine became the standard, and for the next 50 years, very little was done to improve it. In the 1763 of our world, James Watt was a young instrument maker at the University of Glasgow. He was assigned to repair a Newcomen machine, and in carrying out that task, he noticed how inefficient the machine really was, and he began to think about how he could make it better. I won't go into the engineering aspects of what he did. Suffice to say that he came up with a more powerful, more efficient, more economical design. He got a patent and spent the next 6 years trying to market his invention. I guess he never saw those late-night commercials with George Foreman. Thank you. It wouldn't be my class if I didn't get off one wisecrack. In 1775, he came into contact with Matthew Boulton, a manufacturer in the business of making candlesticks and buttons. An odd pairing, perhaps, but Boulton had the capital, the facilities, and the vision to actually build a machine from Watt's designs. And that single event kicked the Industrial Revolution into high gear. But in the other world, there was no James Watt at the University of Glasgow in 1763. Maybe he died in childhood or was never born at all. Whatever the cause of his absence, he simply wasn't there. So a less imaginative fellow repaired the Newcomen machine brought to the University of Glasgow and was not inspired to improve on it. And the Newcomen engine continued to be used for years after the Watt design came into being in our world. And that made their industrial revolution a lot slower out of the gate. To understand what that delay meant over there, you have to understand what the Industrial Revolution meant here. The most immediate effect on our world was a massive movement of people from the country to the city. Steam power meant factories, and factories meant jobs, or rather, the concentration of jobs in one place. This fundamentally changed the population patterns in England, which had remained static for centuries. And those new patterns brought demands for changes in representation, which led to the Reform Bill of 1832, a major step on the road to parliamentary democracy. And they also brought the urban problems of slums and crime, which led to the birth of modern policing and public health. When steam power was applied to transportation, it was the biggest development in that field since the domestication of the horse. Its importance to commerce cannot be overstated. It slashed the cost of moving goods, which led to lower prices for everything. It greatly improved personal mobility. It made the penny post possible. And all this began at the firm of Boulton and Watt, which not only built the machines, but also fostered the development of a number of young engineers. In that way, it was like the Apple computer of the 18th century, except they had frilly shirts instead of turtlenecks. But over there was no James Watt. Matthew Boulton went on making his candlesticks and buttons with nary a thought given to steam engines. The marvelous talent pool of our world never formed. Isaac Perrins, an engineer/heavyweight boxer. How's that for a combination? Jab, jab, invent! I bet nobody ever took his lunch money in high school. Well, he stuck with his career in the ring, and then went on to become a firefighter. Peter Ewart stayed a millwright, though he did later develop gears that were used in that world's industrial revolution. And William Murdoch, no, not the guy from the TV show, was not inspired to knock on Boulton's door in 1777 in search of a job with the non-existent Watt. He stayed out on his own, working on his own designs. There as here, he invented the gaslight. And over there, it was he who came up with the same steam engine developments that Watt did in our world. He even went to Boulton to build the units, so it's all good, right? Mr. Celsius would say inevitable? Except by the time that happened, that world was about 16 years behind us in steam engine development. And as a result, their industrial revolution took off later than ours. Their mills came later. The population shift to the cities came later. Their political reforms came later. There was no Reform Act in their 1832, which meant that when the Continental Revolutions of 1848 came up, they were just as bad in England as they were in continental Europe. Queen Victoria fled London on April 8th of that year in anticipation of what was about to happen. And on April 10th, Chartist protesters gathered in Kensington Park. Historians of that world estimate that there were 200,000 of them, though contemporary figures vary. The authorities faced them with soldiers and a police force bolstered by the swearing in of 100,000 special constables. Not wanting violence, the Chartist leaders agreed not to march their throng on Parliament, and instead offered to have a small group deliver their petition to the nation's leaders. But an overzealous officer, Captain Sturgeon, refused to accept this compromise. Tempers flared, there was pushing and shoving, stones were thrown, and then the military opened fire on the crowd. About 2,000 people fell. Many of the dead were simply trampled by the panicking mob, and we have no accurate figures on the number of wounded, perhaps because a lot of them did not report their injuries for fear of reprisal. And it was a justified fear. Following the massacre, the government cracked down hard on reformers, jailing their leaders and shutting down newspapers sympathetic to their cause. 12 days later, they passed the Treason Felony Act, which reduced the penalty for certain acts of treason from death to Australian exile. And then they rounded up all the Chartist leaders and gave them one-way tickets to the far side of the world. Said one parliamentarian, "This rids us of the troublemakers on a permanent basis without conferring upon them the status of martyrs. It lets us eat our cake and have it still." And thus reform was delayed for another generation. Let's put to sea and check out what the delay in the arrival of steam power meant there. Nobody in that world knows the names Robert Fulton, John Fitch, or James Rumsey because none of them lived long enough to build a steamboat. The hero over there was William Symington, but again, he did less there than here because our Symington had such a big head start. That world's first Atlantic crossing by steamship didn't happen until 1852. And while progress was steady after that, they never caught up with our world. Their navies didn't start using steam until 1853 and did not entirely phase out sail until the 1890s. Their battleship arms race of the early 20th century saw them building vessels similar to our USS Maine, the ship whose destruction sparked the Spanish-American War. They had nothing like our dreadnoughts until the 1920s. Their civilian vessels were similarly behind ours, still using sail, and sometimes a steam-sail combo, well into the 1890s. Smaller, less advanced vessels on the transatlantic run meant that that world had fewer immigrants come from Europe in the 25 years preceding the First World War. East Coast cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia did not grow as quickly as they did here. Neither did the farming communities of Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and the Plains states, all of which were dependent not only on ships to bring people, but on another steam engine development as well, the railway. The first locomotive in that world didn't run until 1820, and their network of railways was a generation behind ours. In Britain, this meant the penny post came 20 years later than it did here. In America, the delay in railroad development erased one of the key advantages our North had in the Civil War and made their war between the states last until 1867. The North still won and slavery still ended, but more lives were lost in the process. And one less key life was lost, as their Lincoln was not assassinated. Their western frontier opened at a slower pace as the Union Pacific Railway wasn't completed until 1885. Their wars with the Native Americans lasted into the early years of the 20th century. Around the world, the delay in railway development meant that their prices stayed high and mobility stayed low in all countries for another generation. And all this because one little Scotsman wasn't around to look at an existing machine and think of a way to make it better. So what does all this prove? Mr. Celsius would say that it supports his view of waves and inevitabilities. That world did, after all, have an industrial revolution. They did build factories and trains and steamships. But I might say that the delay in the arrival of those things and the subsequent differences in politics, economics, and human migration support my belief that Watt, the great man, had an enormous impact on history. So which of us is right? Could we both be right? Well, that's your assignment. Dig into the materials I brought back and write 2,000 words on this alternate world. You might compare and contrast it with our world on the basis of economy, transportation, communication, or the military. You might look at how the delay of steam power affected their art, literature, or music. And if you're really stuck for an idea, you might want to hold this over your head. Can everybody see it? Well, for those who can't, it's a 100 Murdoch light bulb. Hey, you didn't think they would name it after Watt, did you? That's due next class. Class dismissed. Hi, I'm Gary Wheeler. Alternate History 100 is a labor of love with the twin goals of entertaining you and making you think. If you like what you heard today, please hit the subscribe button, give us a like, and tell your friends about us. Your word of mouth can really help this channel grow. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. Until then, keep thinking and make some history of your own.
The preceding was a work of fiction and should not be taken as actual history.